Hello, everyone. So welcome to our first session of web programming client-side course. And in this part, we are going to talk about chapter 1, where we'll talk about introduction to the internet and World Wide Web, because we need to learn what internet and World Wide Web is before we start learning web programming, right? Okay. So the first thing is network. I think many of you are already familiar with what a network is. And so a network consists of two or more computers connected for the purpose of communicating and sharing resources. The common components of the network are the server, client, and shared devices. So one very good example of a network is on the internet. So internet is the interconnected network of computer. So it's a network of networks that spans across the globe. Okay, so as you can see here in the illustration, so you can see through the network, like different devices, say the client devices, say laptops or desktop machine or personal computers or mobile phones, through the internet are connected to the server, right? So there are other components of the network, but for the purpose of this course, we are just showing these client and server machines. The reason behind that is we want to talk about the client server model, because this course is web programming client side. So we need to know what a client server model is. And after finishing this course, I hope you will also take the web programming server side course. But before that, let's dig in and see what the client server model means. So the client server can describe a relation between two computer programs, the client and the server. First of all, what the client does is it requests some type of service, such as it asks for a file or database access, and it sends this request to the server. Okay, and what does the server do? Whatever the name word server means, it serves something. So whenever a client sends a request, the server transmits the results to the client over the network. Okay. So here is one example of very simple example of communication between the web client and web server. So the web client, you can think of the browser, whatever browser we are using is our web. So we have already shown you that our laptops or mobile phones or personal computers are client devices. And on the client devices, we run client software, which is a web browser. You have different kind of browsers, Chrome or Edge or Firefox. So these browsers are actually web client software, right? And through the web client software, these are web client software because this software, the browser software, is actually running on the web client. It's running on your laptop or your personal computer. So make a request to the web server, and the web server gets that request and it actually responds, right? So let's go a little bit deep what a web client is. Web client is connected to the internet. It usually, so as you have seen, like our laptop or our desktop or mobile phones, all are web clients. And if you want to use this web client to make requests to the server, your web client needs to be connected to the internet. And usually it runs web server or client software or web clients, web browser or web client software, such as Edge or Chrome. It uses the HTTP protocol. It requests web pages from the server and receives web pages and files from the server. Yes, that is what web client is. Whereas the web server, it is also continuously connected to the internet, runs web server software, such as Apache and Internet Information Server. it also uses the HTTP protocol. It receives the request for the web page and responds to the request and transmits the status code, web page, and associated files. Okay. So let me show you one example. So here we can see I have, say, google.com, and I can search anything, right? So say lucky. Okay, so I search this. What happens is you see here I am using a browser, right? So I'm using a browser, and this is the Chrome browser. So, and I'm using it on my laptop. So this is my web client software. And using the web client software, what I did is I actually wrote something here and pressed here. So what happened is these requests from my browser went to Google. And so it went to Google server, and Google server actually read this request and send me some response. So if you go to like Control-Shift-I, it will show you whatever is happening. So if you go to the network tab, and then if I click, say, lucky bowling, whatever it is, just okay. So I'm writing this, and then if I click on, say, search, you'll see some kind of communication is happening here. Okay, so you see here that there was a request made to Google server, and Google server actually sent a lot of responses. So you see I had sent a request to Google server, and then Google server actually sent all the responses. Okay, now let's go back to our slide. Okay, so how does Google server know what kind of request I'm making? So it knows it because the web browser or the client software, and the Google server, they use the same protocol. That means protocols, you can think protocols as languages, right? So if you are talking the same language with your friend, then your friend your friend also understands that language. In that case, you can make communication, right? Or you can make conversation. That same thing happens when the browser makes some request to the server and the server responds. So the protocols means it rules that describes the method used for clients and the servers to communicate with each other over a network. Okay. And when the communication in the internet is happening, we don't use any single protocol. There are different protocols that we use, and these protocols actually do different functions. The most important one that we need to know is the HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It's a set of rules for exchanging files such as text, graphic images, sound, video, and other multimedia files on the web. And web browsers actually send HTTP requests for web pages and their associated files. And web servers, the web browsers are the clients, right? So these are the client software. And web servers, they send HTTP response and the requested files back to the web browser. And you are familiar with this one as well, HTTPS. So it is Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure. So this combines HTTP with encoded encryption protocol. If I go back to our browser again, if I just write something, say HTTPS, okay, so this is like, say, it takes me to my Instagram page. So if I enter this on the web browser, so basically I'm telling that I'm using, this is what this says is, I'm making a request to the Instagram server using the HTTPS protocol, okay? And then once I make the request, Instagram server actually, you are seeing that it's sending back a response to me because it understands the HTTPS, whatever request I made, using the HTTPS protocol or HTTPS language. So it understands that and it sends me back the page, the home page. Okay, so as you have seen that I had typed an address on the web browser, and the request was sent to the web server, which was Instagram server, and then the response was sent back because the Instagram server also uses the HTTPS protocol. Now, the realistic question is, how does it reach the endpoint or reach? There are like billions of server, right? So if I type on like like https slash www.instagram.com, how does it exactly land on Instagram server? So basically underneath what we use is IP address. I'm going to show you how IP address comes into the play here. So each device connected to the internet has a unique numeric IP address. So I'm making the request from my machine or my laptop, and my laptop also has some kind of IP address. Um, so the IP addresses consists of set of 4 groups of numbers. So 172.217.22.0. This one is an IP address associated with www.google.com. So as I say, like an IP address may correspond to a domain name. So what a domain name is, domain name locates an organization or other entity on the internet. So domain name system, it divides the internet into logical groups and understandable names, associates unique computer IP addresses with the text-based domain names you type into web browser. So if you type, say, this http google.com, it may take you to this IP address. Now, what is the relationship between the domain name and the IP address, right? So this is, you may have this question, right? Okay, so let me show you one example. So let's say we are at, say, initially we are at bing.com, right? And then if I just copy this, you see now I have just IP address copied, right? And if I try to click enter, it will take me to google.com. So you can see here that the address says google.com, but I had typed an IP address. So now we can see a domain name here, right? So what you saw at www.google.com, that was a URI. URI means Uniform Resource Identifier, or you can say URL. URL is Uniform Resource Locator. This is also a type of URI which represents the network location of a resource, such as a web page or a graphic file or an MP3 file. So here is one example of a URL. You can see here, this part is the domain name. So this one actually says, this one actually says where your server is. And then adding to that, you put this folder name and index.html. This means that you are telling, once you are actually typing this whole thing, you are telling your browser to contact a server with this domain name. And inside that server, there is a folder named, server is a computer, right? Inside that computer, you have a folder named chapter1, and inside that, there is a file called index.html, right? Okay, so we are back with the same thing, with the same discussion, like how an IP address actually represents, is associated with a domain name, right? Okay, because we had typed Google's IP address and it aligned or got associated with Google's domain name. So here is how actually this is done. So from your browser, you actually first, when you type www.google.com, it goes to a server called DNS server. So your ISP have all the addresses of the DNS server stored. So whenever you type something, it goes to the DNS server, and from the DNS server, you get the IP address, because what happens is, in this case, in the previous case, we had in the previous case, we knew this IP address, right? But if I don't know the IP address, what happens? It will just, if you click on google.com, let's start again. So if you click on google.com, basically the request, yeah, so the request actually gets an IP address, right? Because all the communication happens through the IP address, but we don't memorize all the IP addresses. So this is how this works. When I actually say www.example.com, it goes to the DNS server, and the DNS server returns the IP address associated with the example.com. So DNS server has some kind of table like this, right? So it has the domain name, and this has the IP address. So again, it's google.com. It had some IP address, and that IP address actually is returned. Now my browser uses that IP address to directly go to the Google server. Say I had written google.com. It went to the DNS server. DNS server sent me back the IP address for Google. I use now the browser in the background uses that IP address to hit on Google server, and Google server now whatever request is sent to Google server now responds with that request, right? So this is how the IP address is associated with domain name. We don't need to remember the IP addresses. The domain name server has all the information, and it gives me the IP address, and using that IP address, we make the communication. So this is again the same thing. So from the web browser, first we type the domain name, and it gives me back the IP address. And now using that IP address, I send HTTP request to the web server, right? And then web server reads the request and sends back the HTTP response. Next, a very important thing, like markup languages. This is important because we're going to learn markup languages for the web programming course, right? So what a markup language is? So markup languages consists of set of directions that tell the browser software how to display and manage a web document. These directions are usually called tags and perform functions, such as displaying graphics, for formatting text, referencing hyperlinks, etc. So one of the most important markup languages is HTML, which we are going to like learn. So just to give you an example, let's say if I click on say bing.com, right? Now, what you see is we have actually a lot of things here, and something is being shown here, right? Your question might be how we are seeing this. So if I click on Control-Shift-I, and if I click on elements, so you'll see that basically once you make a request to the Bing server actually sends you this thing, okay? So it sends you this thing. So you see it sends you this HTML document, and this document is written in HTML, which is the markup language, right? And the browser knows how to convert something like this into this, right? So the browser knows it. So this is the example of a markup language. So in this course, we are going to learn how to code in HTML, which is a markup language. So HTML is a set of markup symbols or codes placed in a file intended for display on a web browser. There are other markup languages like XML. I think you are familiar with XML, but we're not going to discuss it because this is not this is the beyond the scope of this. We are primarily focusing on HTML, and then there is XHTML, that is another kind of markup language. Now, specifically, you are going to use HTML5. There are different versions of HTML. The HTML5 8.2 is the latest one. So for the first part, we described the different components of client-server model as applied to the internet. We identified protocol like HTTP protocol, and then we talked about IP addresses and how IP addresses are associated with domain names and how we type domain names and get IP address from the DNS server. And then we also talked about how a URL is built, right? Using a domain name and other things. So we showed that this is a whole URL, whereas this part is the domain name, and the other parts, actually this part means the protocol. This www dot is a subdomain name. This one means the folder name, and this one means the file name. So this whole thing makes a URL. So that's it for the first part. Stay tuned for the second part, and we'll discuss chapter 2 in the next part of our lecture, where we'll talk about HTML basics. Thanks, everyone.